On August 7th, 1942, U.S. Marines of the 1st Division landed on an obscure Pacific island called Guadalcanal. It marked the first American offensive of World War II. The campaign to secure the island lasted 6 months, and for much of its course, the balance teetered precariously from one side to the other. It included 6 major naval battles, daily aerial engagements, and countless clashes on land. No campaign in either theater saw such sustained action by sea, land, and air. The unpredictable forces of war began to link the United States with Guadalcanal in late May 1942, when advance echelons of the 1st Marine Division embarked for the South Pacific. Destination, New Zealand. Mission, undetermined. Somewhere on some unspecified battleground, sometime in the uncertain future, the untested Marines would clash with the tested soldiers of Japan. The ocean lifeline to the South Pacific was the war's longest and most tenuous. Stretching more than 6,500 miles from California to New Zealand, it tied Australia to the United States. If this supply line were broken, Australia and Asia would be forever Japanese. The advance echelon of the 1st Marine Division arrived at Wellington in mid-June. The Marines were to begin training for a future campaign in the Pacific and didn't expect to see any action for another 6 months. They were green, many of them fresh out of boot camp. Early in July, a lone American plane set in motion a chain of events that would bring American and Japanese forces together at a place that neither side had foreseen. On obscure Guadalcanal, air reconnaissance confirmed what radio intelligence had earlier discovered: the Japanese were building an airfield. What the plane had seen changed the course of the Pacific War. This discovery redirected Operation Watchtower from the Santa Cruz Islands to Guadalcanal and Tulagi, with the assault to take place on August 1st, less than 1 month away. The new target was prophetically codenamed Cactus. No one on either side could have predicted the grueling 6-month struggle that would ensue. Before dawn on August 7th, the amphibious task force separated into 2 groups as it approached Savo Island, one bound for Guadalcanal and the other Tulagi. The Japanese were not aware that the enemy was upon them. The first shells from the cruiser Quincy's turrets hurled America's reply to the nation that contrived Pearl Harbor. August 7th, 1942, the United States of America takes the offensive against the Empire of Japan.
Daylight, they started shelling the islands, Guadalcanal and Tulagi, and there were planes in the air bombing the area over there where they found the concentrations at, I guess.
6- and 8-inch naval guns spouted flame as thousands of tense Marines began to move slowly down the cargo nets suspended from the decks of the transports.
Had to climb down the rope landing nets down the side of the ship and try and time the surge of the Higgins boat with the roll of the ship so that when you stepped off the landing net, you hit the boat instead of falling in the water between the boat and the ship. And fortunately, I think most of us made it.
Well, it was pretty scary, I'll tell you. They loaded about 4 Higgins boats at a time, and they'd go out and they'd load the next 4, and then they'd go out and circle, and they'd go out. When they got the Higgins boats all loaded, they spread out, and all went in and hit the beach at the same time in different areas.
11,000 Marines would go ashore in the first amphibious assault by U.S. forces since 1898. The day of hit and run in the Pacific was over. The hour of hit and stay had come. The first Marines ashore in the campaign to capture the Solomons landed not on Guadalcanal, but on Tulagi. Just 2 miles long and half a mile wide, its proximity to nearby Florida Island made the capture of certain key features on Florida essential. A promontory on Florida overlooked the landing beach on Tulagi, and it was feared that Japanese artillery could wreak havoc on the amphibious force if this strategic point remained in Japanese hands. In addition to Tulagi, 2 small enemy-held islets, Gavutu and Tanambogo, were also to be seized. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines landed unopposed near the village of Halita on Florida Island. They quickly reached the desired promontory and successfully secured the flank. The landing at Tulagi went off as scheduled at 0800.
Where I landed at, we had to wade. We jumped over the side and had to wade waist deep on into the island because it was coral. And I'll tell you, it was pretty rough for the pack on your back. And of course, I didn't have a gun. They didn't give us guns when we first went out there. But we had a pretty heavy pack on our back with our medical supplies. And Red Cross on your shoulder, which we got rid of. They were using them for targets. There wasn't much contact with the Japs until we got inland about 100 yards.
Upon reaching the shore, the 1st Raider Battalion and the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines began to make their way inland. The Raiders encountered Japanese resistance almost immediately. During the first day's action, the Raiders advanced toward the southeastern tip of Tulagi. At dusk, the units consolidated and dug in for the night.
That first night on Tulagi was indicative of what the Marines would face throughout the campaign in the Pacific. The Japanese launched 4 different counterattacks, which were all thrown back. But the ferocity of those attacks was really shocking to the Marines.
Over the next day and a half, the Raiders continued their push down the island. The cave complex and dug-in positions at the base of a deep man-made cut provided the most intense fighting on Tulagi. By the evening of August 9th, effective Japanese resistance on Tulagi had been eliminated. Gavutu and Tanambogo, connected by a causeway and each with prominent hills held by Japanese forces, were to be seized by 2 companies of the Marine 1st Parachute Battalion. The plan called for an amphibious assault to capture Gavutu before mounting an attack on Tanambogo over the causeway. Problems were immediately encountered when the assault boats were forced to divert from their intended landing area at a concrete seaplane ramp. Naval shelling prior to the invasion was so devastating that it had completely destroyed the original landing site. Forced to divert farther north, the Paramarines found themselves pinned down by fire from 3 sides. Casualties were taken, but gradually the Marines gained the upper hand. By 1800, the American flag flew over Gavutu, but above Tanambogo, a rising sun banner whipped defiantly. The following day, Tanambogo was inundated by a series of naval and aerial attacks. Tragically, bombs from Navy Dauntlesses fell short of their target, and several Marines on Gavutu were killed or wounded. Naval shelling proved more reliable, as first the destroyer San Juan and later Buchanan swept in to blast Japanese positions. At 1600, just minutes after Buchanan's devastating bombardment, the Marines landed on Tanambogo to little opposition. About 750 Japanese had died defending Tulagi and Gavutu Tanambogo, while 144 Americans were killed and nearly 200 wounded. The capture of the islands had not been costly as measured by the heartless business of war, yet it seemed so when compared with what faced the men scheduled to land on Guadalcanal. At 0910, landing craft carrying the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 5th Marines, jarred to a stop on Beach Red. Guadalcanal.
The landing itself, completely unopposed. There was nobody on the beach when we got there. We did hear some firing, and it was Seabees that had been on the beach for hours before we got there that were shooting coconuts out of trees. We were supposed to be scared, and we were, till we found out, hell, there was nothing there.
By necessity, Vandegrift's plan was not complex. The 5th Marines were to proceed along the coast to secure the flank, while the 1st Marines would move inland along the Tenaroo River and secure a grassy knoll identified as Mount Austin that lay a short distance from Beach Red.
The whole countryside there was either coconut groves or big high grass fields. Grass, well, some of it as high as your head. And it was just miserable going. And so we struggled along, pulling our communications carts and dragging everything. And I guess by the end of the day, we got back up, just starting back up into the hills.
The password went out, and there was some shooting going on in the night, but it was mostly between guards that were set up on the perimeter and people that didn't know or had forgotten the password. I don't think anybody got hurt, but they very well could have.
August 8th began with a westward advance by all Marine forces on Guadalcanal. The 5th Marines continued toward Lunga Point, while the 1st Marines swung toward the Lunga River and approached the airfield from the south. Contact with small groups of Japanese began to occur as the Marines closed in on the airfield, but resistance was quickly overrun, and by 1600, the Marines had taken the airstrip.
The airstrip was essentially a wide spot in the road and was only marginally useful at the time that the Marines occupied that area, and was badly in need of improvement with pierced steel planking called Marston matting, or with gravel that could extend the useful length of the runway.
2 enemy camps and a large amount of equipment were also captured. Japanese trucks were put to use in hauling supplies from the beachhead, and the large caches of food, chiefly rice, would prove invaluable in the coming days. At 12:30 hours, a formation of 40 Japanese dive and torpedo bombers flew into a literal storm of steel thrown up by warships near Tulagi. Those that escaped the intense anti-aircraft fire were fallen upon by fighters from WASP. All but one of the 45 bombers that made the attack was shot down. Prior to the air raid, Japanese ships were spotted steaming toward Guadalcanal, but due to communications failures, the report failed to reach naval and marine commanders on the island. Under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the task force approached unchecked. By nightfall on August 8th, the beachhead extended a mile inland and 4 miles along the shore. The Marines owned the airstrip and nearly all the ground required to defend it. Vandegrift and his staff had reason to feel optimistic, but that feeling was not to last. Summoned aboard the Macaulay by Rear Admiral Richmond Turner, Vandegrift learned that Admiral Jack Fletcher's covering force, including all 3 aircraft carriers, had withdrawn due to fuel shortage and aircraft losses. Fletcher's departure left Turner with no choice. He would have to withdraw the amphibious task force, less than half unloaded, the following day, leaving behind only a small force of cruisers and destroyers. Due to the 3 entrances to the Sound, the Allied forces were compelled to divide into 3 patrolling squadrons: Southern, Northern, and Eastern. Behind the screen of warships, the transports lay off Lunga Point. Early on the morning of August 9th, Mikawa's force slipped unseen past the 2 destroyer pickets at the mouth of the Sound. The stage was set for the most humiliating defeat ever inflicted upon the U.S. Navy. Using standard Japanese tactics, Mikawa first launched torpedoes. 0145, a pair found the Australian ship Canberra. 6- and 8-inch gunfire followed, and Canberra was finished. Moments later, the heavy cruiser Chicago was hit. And while she managed to limp away, Chicago failed to report that an attack was underway. 15 minutes later, the Japanese fell upon the northern force, cruising sedately along in patrol formation. Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria were quickly gunned into sinking hulks and joined Canberra as the first layer of steel in what would become known as Iron Bottom Sound.
After Admiral Mikawa defeats the American Navy off Savo Island, the transports, who are unloading at Lunga Point, are completely defenseless. However, he elects at that point to withdraw because he is afraid of an American carrier strike with the first light. Now, obviously, if he had known that the American carriers had already withdrawn, he would have continued and destroyed the transports and leaving the Marines completely at the mercy of the Japanese Navy.
August 9th, Marines watched as Allied vessels picked up survivors and then slipped away through columns of smoke from the still burning remains of the American fleet.
People were washing up ashore. Some of them were swimming ashore. I don't know how many boats were sunk out there. I think I've read since then, but it was kind of a mess as far as our Navy was concerned.
In the Battle of Savo Island, 700 men were wounded and nearly 1,100 perished. For the American Navy, it was the worst disaster since Pearl Harbor. In just half an hour, the Japanese had changed the entire picture of an easy American victory at Guadalcanal. Virtually defenseless, the battered American Navy had no choice but to withdraw. When the last ships left, late on the 9th, General Vandegrift's Marines were all alone.
All the ships pulled out, and they weren't done unloading yet. But they just all bailed out on us, and by mid-afternoon, they were all gone. So we did feel kind of halfway abandoned. And to be real honest, we didn't see any more American ships for a long time.
The Marines really were left on a shoestring, and they started calling the Guadalcanal operation not Operation Watchtower, but Operation Shoestring, because supplies were so much in demand.
The withdrawal of the transports had left the Marines with only part of their supplies, and now with no air cover, it became imperative to get what supplies had come ashore off the beaches where they were extremely vulnerable to attack. No air support would be available until the airfield was completed, and that task was made difficult by a lack of proper equipment, most of which sailed away before it could be unloaded. Forced to employ Japanese equipment to improve the runway, the engineers' task was further complicated by the unrivaled Japanese air superiority. Operating from bases in the northern and central Solomons, Japanese planes dominated the skies.
The problem at Guadalcanal was that the Japanese had the ability to come down and bomb it from both Bougainville and Rabaul.
The Japanese unleashed full fury from the sky. They went all out to destroy the airfield, planning to retake it later. 5 days after the landing, the airstrip was ready, and the Marines christened it Henderson Field to honor a fallen buddy. The field was designed and construction started by the Japanese, and it was completed with captured equipment, but the planes that would use it were American. General Vandegrift believed the Japanese were certain to take advantage of the Marines' predicament and launch an attack. Perimeter defenses were thus improved and patrols sent out to probe for the enemy. One such patrol sent to investigate reports of Japanese landings east of the Marine perimeter stumbled into a Japanese reconnaissance party, and in the ensuing firefight, 31 Japanese infantrymen were killed, leaving no doubt that Imperial Army troops were filtering ashore. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki's force of 900 men had landed at Taivu Point on August 19th in the first run of what the Marines came to call the Cactus Express. Later known as the Tokyo Express, these operations achieved the regularity of a crack railroad run. As defenses were being improved to guard against an attack from the east, the familiar sound of incoming aircraft signaled the Marines to start for their foxholes. However, these planes had come to land at Henderson Field, not to bomb it. The arrival of 12 Marine Dauntlesses and 19 Wildcats provided a tremendous boost for the men on the ground.
When Lieutenant Colonel Dick Mangrum and Major John L. Smith arrived with their SBDs and F-4Fs, it immediately gave a huge boost to morale among the Marine infantrymen on Guadalcanal, who had become accustomed to seeing only airplanes with rising suns painted on their wings. But now there were white-starred airplanes, and even though they arrived without much maintenance capability, at least they were able to start intercepting the Japanese daily bombing raids.
After we got some planes, that made all the difference in the world. Then from then on, they kept building up our Air Force, and it got to where it was a pretty respectable unit after a while.
Across the Tenaru, Ichiki was preparing his troops to retake the airfield. Early on the morning of August 21st, he gathered his men at the mouth of the river. Colonel Ichiki's force of 900 men was to be joined later by 1,500 more. But Ichiki had been given orders that permitted him to attack whenever he saw fit. Intelligence reports indicated that the American presence on the island was no greater than a raiding party cowering in a defensive perimeter around the airfield. With the element of surprise lost through the encounter east of the Tenaru, Ichiki decided to attack. At 01:30, the Japanese charged across the Tenaru with bayonets fixed, and the Marines were ready for them.
We had one thing going for us. We had 37-millimeter guns with canister loads. The canister load is a load of essentially buckshot cast, I think, in beeswax. And there's an awful lot of shot there, and it spreads like a sawed-off shotgun. And we had 2 or 3 of those dug in covering that sand spit, plus machine guns and everything else. And it was just an absolute massacre.
It was almost like a turkey shoot as the Japanese came across, and were going to try to get across the river, almost at the mouth of the river where you could wade in the sand, but there was a slaughterhouse there.
Greatly outnumbered at the point of attack, the Japanese were cut down on the banks of the Tenaru. Only a few dazed bands survived, and at morning light, the Marines crossed the shallow river to carry the attack.
They moved the 2nd Battalion around behind them to trap them, and then they just started shelling the bejesus out of the spot they were in. Some of them were trying to swim away, and it was a case of not so much can you get him, but who can get him first. And then they brought the tanks up, and the tanks moved out into this little peninsula sort of area of where they were. And the tanks thrashed around out there, flushing them out. And they just were heaped up on the sand spit at the mouth of the river.
By dusk, nearly 800 Japanese, including Colonel Ichiki, were dead. Somehow only 44 Marines were lost. Henderson had been defended for the first time, and the planes, which had arrived the day before, were safe. As August drew to a close, events on Guadalcanal settled into routine monotony. Daily, the Japanese would stage air raids, but the long flight from Rabaul meant bomber formations could be expected between 11:30 and 14:30.
At certain times of the day, you didn't want to be around Henderson Field. I mean, it was heavy stuff. It'd shake the ground wherever you were at.
A curious tactical situation had developed at Guadalcanal as mastery of the seas was exchanged every 12 hours. The Americans ruled during daylight hours as ships unloaded and launches dashed around the Sound. Twilight signaled a quick Allied exodus and the arrival of the Tokyo Express. These troop carriers and their escorts would dash in to discharge soldiers or a freight, and while departing, they would toss a few shells in the Marines' direction.
I laid in the foxhole one night, and they was shooting at us with a pretty good-sized gun, and it was sizzling right over the tops of our heads and through the coconut trees. And that's pretty scary, laying in a hole, not knowing where the next one's going to hit.
The last day of August brought more grief to the Marines on Cactus when the carrier Saratoga, on defensive patrol southeast of Guadalcanal, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Though she was later repaired, Saratoga was out of the fight for Guadalcanal. Vandegrift learned of her loss with a sinking heart, for intelligence reports indicated that the Tokyo Express had been landing troops and supplies with increasing regularity. Major General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi, commander of the 35th Infantry Regiment, had more than 5,000 troops near Taivu Point, more than twice the number of Marines believed to be on the island. While American manpower was grossly underestimated, Kawaguchi could expect to have overwhelming superiority at the point of attack, with the additional advantage of choosing when and where it would occur. Moreover, the Japanese would be facing defenders who were beginning to show the effects of little food and even less rest.
When food gets short, people start getting nasty, you know. We knew we had no support because the food stuff wasn't coming in. We were scrounging. We were finding Japanese rice sacks. They had big woven sacks that you could find out in the brush. So we had that.
Hunger aside, day-to-day existence on Guadalcanal was difficult in the extreme.
The thing that people will always talk about regarding not just Henderson Field but Guadalcanal is that it was widely held it was the only place on earth where you could stand up to your knees in mud and still have dust blowing your eye.
Living conditions weren't too good. You slept on the ground. We didn't have tent camps or tents to live in. It was a case of shelter halves and whatever you can rustle up to keep the rain off. Fortunately, we were young and flexible and stupid. Didn't seem to bother us too much, but...
Subject to frequent shelling and constantly under the threat of air attack, the Marines were additionally harassed through a variety of Japanese tactics.
At night, they had, we called them Washing Machine Charlie, some kind of a little airplane that made funny noises, and he'd just come flying around, and it just kept everybody awake more than anything else. He never really did any serious damage. He'd always drop one bomb.
But these Japanese attempts to discourage the Marines were not without their lighter moments.
This damn Jap submarine would come every day without fail, and he'd just cruise up and down offshore and shoot at us. We had an old Marine Corps character. I think he was older than the hills even then. He'd been in Haiti and Nicaragua and God knows where all, China, named Lou Diamond. And he was the master mortarman of all mortarmen that ever were. And he took his mortar platoon down to the beach one day. And he set up that mortar, and damned if he didn't hit that submarine. A mortar is not going to hurt a submarine, but it sure made him submerge.
As September entered its second week, barge convoys to Kamimbo Bay had swelled the number of Japanese in the area to nearly 2,000. Under Colonel Oka, they were to coordinate with Kawaguchi's force to attack on September 12th. Planning to move by sea to an area near the Matanikau, inadequate shipping crippled the plan. The two Japanese units were 70 miles apart, with dense jungle and American Marines in between. Kawaguchi thus designated Oka's force the left wing and slated them to attack the southwest quarter of the Marine perimeter. The main assault would come from the south, led by Kawaguchi's 3 infantry battalions. The remnants of Ichiki's force, now designated the Kuma Battalion, would attack from the southeast. The Japanese advance began on September 9th, but soon bogged down. Unable to clear more than just a narrow path, the march through the jungle was torturous. Soaked in sweat or drenched by rain, the Japanese plodded on. Ever mindful of exposing their advance, open areas had to be avoided rather than sought. But however slowly, the Japanese were coming. Southwest of Henderson, a broken grassy ridge stretched 1,000 yards through the jungle to the banks of the Lunga River. When the Japanese attacked, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Thomas and Colonel Edson were convinced it would be there. They presented their conclusions to Vandegrift, and on September 10th, Edson moved the raiders and paratroops to what he jokingly termed a rest area. By 1400, they were fortifying what his men referred to as Edson's Ridge. The Marines on Edson's Ridge drove themselves to complete their fortifications, a series of strong points with overlapping fields of fire. The terrain and denseness of the jungle, combined with the small number of men, precluded anything resembling a continuous line. To the rear, artillery batteries were registered to give Edson's men close support. The only available reserves, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, was moved into supporting positions. The Marine commanders were certain the enemy was coming that night. It was up to the raiders on the ridge to stop them. At the point of attack, 840 Marines would face over 2,000 Japanese. Below the ridge, Kawaguchi rushed to organize his men. The march through the jungle had scattered his detachments, and another day of preparation was in order. But he had assured Rabal that he would attack on the 12th. With no means of radio communication, Kawaguchi had no choice. He deployed his men along the Lunga, opposite the Marine right flank, and awaited the naval bombardment that was to precede his attack. 3 hours before midnight on September 12th, 20 minutes of bombardment from ships offshore signaled the beginning of the battle for Edson's Ridge. Machine gun and rifle fire broke out, and the Kawaguchi Brigade came pouring out of the jungle, probing for weak spots in the Marine line. They drove the raiders back and advanced down the Lunga to attempt an encirclement, but they lost their way once they left the riverbank, and mortar and artillery fire drove them back. On the left, the paratroops were struck. Holes were driven through their lines, but the Japanese failed to capitalize. At dawn, the Marines counterattacked, but there were not enough men to carry the fight.
After this first night on the Bloody Ridge, Colonel Edson will pull the Marines back 100 yards, which will allow him to tighten his perimeter. The defense will be much improved. Fields of fire will be improved. The Japanese will have another 100 yards of open ground to attack across, and that gives him some more space to employ his artillery firepower on those attacking Japanese.
By the afternoon of the 13th, Marines on the ridge were sleepwalking after nearly 72 sleepless hours. They had expected to be relieved by Vandegrift's reserve, but air raids prevented this. Kawaguchi had been thwarted in his initial attempt when neither Colonel Oka in the west nor the Kuma Battalion in the east attacked as scheduled. As night began to fall, General Kawaguchi was certain a better coordinated effort would overwhelm the Americans. Edson's men had prepared a defensive line 1,800 yards long. Deployed in combat groups of approximately platoon strength, they were organized at about 100-yard intervals. At 1830, the first blows fell on the ridge as 2,000 Japanese sprinted toward the Marines in waves. They bent back the lines, but they could not break them. Even as the raiders were resisting the charge, shells began to drop on Henderson. To the east, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, faced the Kuma Battalion.
We were spread out awful thin. It was just almost a one-man line. We did have double apron wire out, and it as good a defense as you could put together. But there was this field of high grass in front of us, and they had come through the grass. Again, they hit in the middle of the night. Why they picked the night to do all these things, I'm not sure. But they hit in the middle of the night, and everybody from Headquarters Company spent the rest of the night hauling ammunition up to the line because they were just using it like it was going out of style.
U.S. artillerymen rained shells down on the Kuma Battalion as they struggled through the barbed wire. Those who got through were met by machine gun fire. Back on the ridge, only about 300 Marines remained. Edson pulled them back to the spine of the ridge, only 1,500 yards from Henderson. But there they stayed while the Japanese suffered an onslaught of steel. Colonel Edson called in artillery fire, bringing it ever closer to his own lines. 105mm shells rained down on the Japanese. Throughout the long dawn of September 14th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, known thereafter as Bloody Ridge, flickered and flared. At daybreak, P-400 spewed cannon fire into Kawaguchi's assembly points, while tanks drove back the remainder of the Kuma Battalion. The third prong of Kawaguchi's master plan, Colonel Oka's force, finally attacked the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines at daybreak. The attack was driven off with the help of an artillery barrage, as were several feeble attempts later that day. The men that remained from all 3 Japanese units were forced to withdraw into the jungle.
The morning after the battle we had on the Bloody Ridge episode thing, the cooks showed up with our usual ration of oatmeal, and you had to pick the worms and the weevils and the bugs out of it. Some of them walked out, but some of them you had to pick out with a fork, and powdered milk, and they brought that up for our breakfast, and the colonel just hit the ceiling. And he got on those cooks, and it's not really repeatable what he called them, but he said, you get back there and you be back here in 30 minutes with pancakes for these men. And by God, they were. Of course, they had weevils in them too, but at least they were cooked weevils.
The Marines achieved a significant victory in the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Had the Japanese succeeded in retaking Henderson Field, the Marines would have had a difficult time holding the island. The raiders and paratroops suffered 263 American casualties, with 59 killed or missing. Recorded losses in other units added another 38 killed and 18 wounded. Japanese losses were estimated at more than 700 killed and 500 wounded. Kawaguchi's failure shocked the Japanese command, and by September 19th, a plan to retake Guadalcanal had been fashioned. The Army's presence on the island was to be significantly upgraded, while the Navy and its air wing would attempt to halt U.S. supply operations. The Americans also issued a revised plan, establishing for the first time a complete perimeter defense. Japanese tendencies played strongly in its design, most notably their disregard for the effectiveness of massed firepower. During the first 3 weeks of October, the Tokyo Express was able to swell the Japanese presence on the island to approximately 14,000. Among the freshly landed troops was the elite Sendai 4th Infantry Division.
The Japanese Army and the Navy, in a rare display of serious inter-service cooperation instead of rivalry, mounted a multi-phased attack on Guadalcanal. This was a genuinely serious effort to throw the Americans off the island and end the Allied threat to their southern flank.
The Japanese scheme provided for attacks on the American perimeter at 3 points. General Sumiyoshi was to distract American attention to the coastal corridor, while General Maruyama led the Sendai Division, 7,000 men, on a jungle march to attack from the south. An amphibious assault at Coley Point was to provide the coup de grace. The attack was to commence on October 22nd, but the jungle stymied the movement of Maruyama's force. With no equipment to clear the way, the Sendai was forced to hack its way through. With each man carrying ammunition, an artillery shell, and some rations, the column inched along the trail. Disassembled artillery pieces lagged farther and farther behind. Maruyama considered his difficulties and postponed the attack 24 hours. The next day, he pushed the date back to the 24th.
The American commanders have a captured Japanese map that details the three-pronged attack, but other than that, they have really no hard intelligence. Their ground and aerial patrols have turned up no Japanese activity except on the Matanikau. And so it seems logical to the commanders that the map may be a ruse, and that they begin then to focus all their efforts at the Matanikau, and the Japanese do everything they can to draw American attention to that front.
Omens for an attack along the coast were offered up in the form of increased artillery fire directed mainly at Henderson. Infantry-supported tanks were sent out, and finally, shelling was redirected toward the east bank of the Matanikau. Had communications between Japanese units not broken down, the feint may have worked to perfection. However, General Sumiyoshi was unaware of Maruyama's second postponement, and on the evening of the 23rd, his forces attacked. Elements of the 4th Infantry, accompanied by tanks, struck at the Americans, but 10 Marine artillery battalions had registered their guns on the mouth of the Matanikau and the coastal track behind it. Over 6,000 rounds crushed the infantry attack, and anti-tank weapons destroyed most of the advancing tanks. The Japanese suffered heavy casualties and scarcely made a scratch in the Marine line. The attack confirmed the belief that the major assault would come from the west, and Colonel Hannikin's battalion was pulled out of the line south of the airfield and redeployed, leaving Chesty Puller's battalion to defend a 2,500-yard front. By October 24th, Maruyama's force had reached its assembly area south of Henderson. Exhausted by their 6-day trek, they prepared to mount an attack supported by little more than unyielding devotion to their emperor. Artillery pieces and mortars had been mostly abandoned, making machine guns their most formidable weapons. As the Japanese began working their way toward final jump-off points, the jungle continued to wreak havoc on their assault plan. Units lost their way or became separated, and when the attack was finally launched, it came off piecemeal and lacked coordination. The Sendai lurched toward the Americans, with the leading elements reaching the Marine line about 2,200. Skirmishes began to foot up along the perimeter, and by 0130, Puller recognized that a major attack was in progress. Puller requested reinforcement, and the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry was sent to link up with the Marines. The situation dictated that the soldiers be intermingled with Marines along the front lines, and together they successfully halted the Japanese attack. During the night, a small salient was established in the center of Puller's line, but the toehold was quickly eradicated. An erroneous report to Tokyo suggested that the Marines were teetering on the edge of defeat, and Fleet Headquarters believed a naval bombardment might push them over. Japanese naval and air units were dispatched to Guadalcanal to provide the blow and also to cover the amphibious landing at Coley Point.
And they were bombing along the runway, and by the time it was over, they ran out of bombs, fortunately, quarter of a mile from us. But by the time it was over, I was just shaking so bad that one of the guys gave me a cigarette, and it really calmed my nerves down, and I've been smoking the damn things ever since. So someday I'm going to sue the Marine Corps for starting me smoking.
Although most Americans spent the day below ground on Dugout Sunday, the Cactus Air Force met the Japanese with a vengeance. Wildcats continuously roared off, engaged flights of Zeros and bombers, landed, rearmed, refueled, and took off again, and in the process claimed 12 enemy planes. SBDs engaged the surface fleet, sinking one light cruiser and damaging 2 destroyers.
My respect for the real heroes of those early days in the Solomon Islands were the flyers. Those guys would come back, and every day some of them didn't come back. And the guy would get out of bed the next morning and get back and go and do it again. And I don't think the people of the United States don't understand what that group of people did. Every day they got up and went back.
While air and naval forces held center stage, ground commanders on both sides reassessed the situation. Puller and Hall's battalions were separated and redeployed, with the Division Reserve stationed just behind them. Counting on better coordination, the Japanese battle plan was virtually unchanged.
The Japanese were so confident that it was going to work that they launched a major fighter sweep from Rabaul, which was to orbit Henderson Field and wait for a prearranged signal from the Japanese army on the ground saying that it was all right to come on down and land.
That night, Maruyama's 16th and 29th Infantry Regiments again attacked the southern perimeter. Without artillery preparation or knowledge of the enemy's position, placing faith in spiritual power over firepower, the Sendai rushed to their destruction.
Line defense set up with crossfires arranged, that whole works. And the guys back in the trees would holler and say they're coming through the wire at such and such a spot. So they would set their machine guns and everything to saturate that particular entry through the wire. And there was a lot of Japanese killed there.
At 0300, Colonel Oka's forces attacked Hannikin's battalion on a ridge east of the Matanikau. The Marines on the left were forced to fall back, but before the Japanese could consolidate their position, a hastily collected group that included runners and cooks launched a counterattack, and after a short, vicious fight, Oka's men were forced to withdraw. The Japanese land offensive of late October failed for many reasons, not the least of which was the skill and determination with which the Americans fought. Equally accountable, though, was the Japanese command's tactical inflexibility. Rather than drawing from the failures of Ichiki and Kawaguchi, they arrogantly went forward with a plan that broke down for many of the same reasons. That Vandegrift and his staff benefited from Japanese inflexibility is undeniable, but it does not diminish the brilliance with which they met this most critical phase of the campaign.
The climax of the Guadalcanal campaign occurred in the middle of November with the last major effort on the part of the Japanese to reinforce their garrison on the island. By that point, the Japanese saw the way the campaign was going, and the large majority of the troops who were still on the island were in no condition to carry on. They were disease-ridden. Hundreds and thousands of them eventually starved to death. So reinforcement was absolutely vital if the Japanese were to retrieve the situation.
On the eve of this massive Japanese effort, Admiral Turner ran 2 separate groups of transports to Guadalcanal. Turner dispatched Rear Admiral Norman Scott to accompany one group and Admiral Daniel Callahan to escort the other. Early light on November 12th revealed the transports and their escort lying safely off Lunga Point. 5,500 replacements came ashore, among them the 182nd Infantry Division. Rabaul soon learned of the transport's presence, and at 1400, 16 torpedo-armed bombers materialized over Guadalcanal. The entire attack lasted 8 minutes, but 16 planes fell, including 4 American and 1 pilot. These losses were made up later that day when the first P-38s arrived, giving the Cactus Air Force 77 operational planes.
The thing that most people don't realize about operating from Henderson Field in those months of 1942 is how close run a thing it was. There were a couple of occasions where only one SBD was airworthy on the entire island. There were times when you had 3 or 4 times as many pilots as available airplanes. It was a meat grinder, and the case has been made that despite all the battles that came before and after Guadalcanal, that campaign was the one which really defined the way the war was going to go, because it involved the type of attrition warfare that a small island nation such as Japan simply could not hope to win.
The enemy task force was sighted steaming toward Guadalcanal prior to noon on the 12th, and Turner surmised that the Japanese intended to either attack his transports as they withdrew or bombard Henderson. To his credit, Turner continued unloading operations until late in the day, then withdrew with only a nominal screen, leaving 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers behind to engage the Japanese. Admiral Callahan, whom Turner left in command, was faced with an urgent situation, but he had neither the experience nor the training for the mission he had received. After seeing the transport safely away, he organized his ships into a line-ahead formation and awaited the Japanese. Early on the 13th, the Japanese bombardment force entered Iron Bottom Sound, built around battleships Hai and Kirishima. Confident that there were no American warships present, hundreds of bombardment projectiles were stacked around the 14-inch turrets. Callahan's task force approached the Japanese at 20 knots on nearly a reciprocal course. Well after the van destroyers, cruiser Helena's effective SG radar first detected the enemy at 0124 at a range of 27,000 yards. This picture was not clear to Callahan, whose choice of flagship denied him the use of SG radar. At 0141, the leading Japanese and American destroyers sighted each other, and within minutes, the entire Japanese force knew of the contact. Confusion reigned as the range between the leading elements decreased to a ludicrous 1,000 yards. Whether by fate or through tactical blunders, Callahan had brought on a point-blank brawl of monstrous proportions. At 0148, 24 minutes after Helena positively identified enemy ships closing the range, Callahan issued the order, "Stand by to open fire." Ships opened fire from all directions, and the battle soon degenerated into individual ship-to-ship actions. In the confusion, both sides fired on their own ships.
There must have been, I don't know, 15 or 20 ships out there firing at each other. And then I saw this cruiser, light cruiser, blow up. They must have hit their magazines below that turret. There's a column of fire went up like this, huge column, and in it I could see this turret just turning over and over, blowing up.
On shore, the men gathered to watch this awesome melee.
One of them would fire a broadside and look like a flock of quail taking off. And then a ship would blow up and light up the whole sky, and it was just a fearsome battle. And the next morning, I think it was the Atlanta, was just not too far offshore, and looked just fine until you look through binoculars. There's just holes all along the side, and the whole bridge was just blown off, just as clean as if it had been cut off with a cutting torch. And the San Francisco, the heavy cruiser, was out over towards Savo, dead in the water. And if you got glasses, the whole fantail for maybe 50, 75 feet was just blown off clear down to the waterline. And I think that was Admiral Callahan that was on the bridge that was killed there. But there was also a Japanese battleship out on the horizon that was smoking up a storm, and the planes were just back and forth, the dive bombers particularly.
The Americans on Guadalcanal were treated to a sight they had never seen or perhaps even imagined. There was a huge Japanese battleship, the Hai, steaming slowly in circles. She had been badly damaged during the surface engagement during the night, and this was simply the Big Rock Candy Mountain to the Marines who had been on the receiving end of so much horrific naval bombardment over the previous few months. And the Enterprise, being the only carrier still in the area, sent a succession of shuttle missions where dive bombers and torpedo planes would attack Hai, land ashore at Henderson Field, rearm, refuel, go back out again, perhaps with their same squadron mates, perhaps with people they had never seen before. And throughout the length of the day, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps air crews gradually wore down that battleship, and she became the first battleship ever sunk by air power by the United States Navy. And as such, it was a significant achievement.
When the battle was over, Admirals Callahan and Scott were dead, as were more than 750 American sailors. Of the 13 American ships involved, only one escaped damage. Barton blew up, Monson sank, Cushing and Laffey were lost, as were the cruisers Atlanta and Juno. The latter finished off by a Japanese submarine as she tried to stagger home after battle, carrying another 700 men to the bottom. Among them were 5 brothers, the Sullivans, who had insisted on serving together despite opposition from their superiors. The loss of Juno and her crew brought total American losses in the aftermath of the naval battle of Guadalcanal to more than 1,400. Halsey sensed that the Japanese had been only temporarily deflected, and he ordered Admiral Kincaid on Enterprise to detach a segment of his covering force to prevent further Japanese incursions. Under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, the battleships South Dakota and Washington and a screen of 4 destroyers sailed immediately for Iron Bottom Sound.
We got word from Cactus Control that there were 75 Jap warships and 3 different task forces coming down. And we looked up, and here was a row of warships on the horizon coming in. And so our skipper called, I was right next to him, I could hear him. He called Cactus Control and says, we have targets, we have ships coming in. He gave their course and their speed, and we were going to attack. And then another voice came on the radio and said, this is Ching Chong Lee. You get your PT boats out of here, I have you on my radar.
By nightfall on November 14th, Admiral Nobutake Kondo was approaching Guadalcanal. His force of 14 warships was built around the battleship Hiroshima. As early as 2200, keen-eyed Japanese lookouts had detected the distant silhouettes of hostile ships, but the disposition of this force was uncertain and was believed to consist of destroyers and new-type cruisers, a notion that was soon to be disproved.
These ships went around behind Savo, and then another group came on behind them. So our skipper called in, he could see them, and he called in and asked Admiral Lee, he says, you have, he gave a course and speed to the ships he saw and said, you have friends behind you, and Admiral Lee came back on the radio and says, I have no friends. And about then, all hell broke loose.
As usual, the Japanese began by firing their deadly long-lance torpedoes, and as usual, they hit their targets. Steelfish sunk the destroyers Walk and Preston and crippled Benham in the opening moments. Only Gwynn escaped the torpedo attack, but gunfire soon drove her from the battle. 2 miles to the rear of the American destroyers, South Dakota was repeatedly losing power due to faulty electrical equipment. Taken under fire by the Japanese, she could reply only with 5-inch gunfire. Her superstructure was riddled and her radar disabled, but her watertight integrity was never compromised. While South Dakota drew the bulk of the attention, Washington approached to within 8,500 yards of the Japanese undetected. Taking Hiroshima under fire, she quickly buried the battleship under an avalanche of fire, scoring 9 16-inch direct hits and more than 35 5-inch hits. While South Dakota retired, Washington proceeded to sink Ayanami and then began to gradually disengage from the action. The bombardment fleet had once again been turned back. For the Japanese, their defeat in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal ended any hope of wresting the island from the Americans. In the course of 3 days' heavy fighting in and around the area, they had lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, 11 combat transports, and the majority of the men and supplies they were to deliver. In spite of heavy losses, the United States had gained the upper hand in the campaign, and the victory signaled the beginning of the end for the Japanese in the Solomons.
Everybody on the ship, it was a struggle, and it was kind of sad because it was a good group.
An epitaph on the grave of one who remained perhaps best sums up the battle that was Guadalcanal. And when he goes to heaven, to St. Peter he will tell, "Another Marine reporting, sir. I've served my time in hell." While the Marines of the 3rd Division were establishing themselves on Bougainville in the final thrust of Operation Cartwheel, in the Central Pacific, the 2nd Marines were preparing to launch their campaign through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. The first blows would fall at Macon Island in the northern Gilberts and at Batio Island in the central Gilberts atoll of Tarawa, destined to become the scene of some of the most concentrated fighting in the Pacific campaign. As a battleground, the islands of the Central Pacific were a world removed from the dense jungles and mountainous terrain encountered in the Southwest Pacific. Relatively flat and sparsely vegetated, their strategic value as sites for airstrips was unquestioned.
The entire Pacific War was pretty much based on the distances of fighters going 2 ways and having some operational time left over whatever target they were attacking.
Within the range of established American bases, Tarawa's location made it a logical stepping stone toward the ultimate goal of Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands. U.S. Naval and Marine Corps commanders saw Tarawa as an opportunity to fine-tune amphibious tactics as a prelude to the main event.
The basic problem for the Marines and landing is one of coordination of fires and follow-on support with those forces that land initially. Somebody will always get to the beach. The question is, can you keep him there? Any ideas that you have can only be resolved under fire. And the Tarawa operation was the great test of the Marine Corps landing doctrine.
And later, at an equivalent scale. It just gave the American public its first real inkling that this is a different kind of war. It was going to cost a lot of lives.
Perhaps the worst thing about Tarawa was the rate of casualties, which probably nobody was fully prepared to accept. The initial landing force loses about 1,000 men killed, another 2,000 wounded. Out of a 4,000 man initial landing force, it's a lot of casualties. This causes the Marines to have to go back and to do a lot of reassessment, rethinking their training, developing some new equipment, and preparing for subsequent landings in the future.
The lessons learned at Tarawa had come at a terrible cost, but resulted in changes in amphibious doctrine that would save countless lives in the months to come.
Sometimes, maybe a bunch of fellows will die, save a lot more. Maybe the lesson learned there of what little damage that bombarding and air bombing and like did might have saved many lives in the Marshalls and Iwo Jima and some of these other fellas, because they learned that a lot of smoke and a lot of noise and a few dropping of bombs and looking like you done blown hell out of everything does damn little damage. So in that respect, I think it was probably worthwhile.
The Marianas Islands have been won. The great Japanese naval base at Truk is cut off, and the Japanese carrier fleet is a shadow of the powerful armada that began the war. America has decisively penetrated the Japanese defensive ring. All that remains is to pierce the inner ring of the Japanese Empire and bring the home islands under the threat of effective assault. However, before this can be accomplished, a promise has to be kept: General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. American strategists now turn their attention to the Palau Group in the Carolines. These islands are only 500 miles from Mindanao and directly on the flank of the projected advance on the Philippines. It's feared that the enemy can counter American thrusts with land-based air power from the Palau airfields. Admiral Nimitz directs that the islands be invaded to secure the flank of MacArthur's invasion.
Peleliu was a logical stopping point on the way into the southern Philippines, again going back to the distance of fighters. It could be reached, bases were ample, they'd already been built, new ones could be built, there was good anchorages around. So there were a lot of reasons it needed to be taken when the operation was planned.
At a high-level Navy conference on the subject, Admiral Halsey, the local commander, dissents. He argues it'll be too costly to conquer the islands and fears a repeat of Tarawa. Halsey proposes instead to bypass the islands and strike the Philippines directly. Admiral Nimitz is unmoved, and preparations begin for an assault on Peleliu and Angaur Islands. In April of 1944, the Japanese began preparing for just such an attack. In the process, they turned the island's high central ridge into a veritable fortress. The ground was laced with extensive natural caves, which the Japanese labored hard to improve and join together in an underground network. All artillery except beach guns were emplaced within these caves and arranged individually to cover specific areas. Units were trained to act independently in support of the general plan should communications fail, and area commanders admonished their men against hopeless suicide attacks or committing harakiri. Merely dying for the emperor would not help the cause. They were to inflict as much damage on the Americans as possible, and counterattack plans were developed toward just such an end. Prior to the scheduled invasion, American land-based and carrier aircraft sweep the area of the Palau Islands to soften up the Japanese defenses. Few Japanese aircraft rise to challenge the Americans, and those that do are swept from the sky in flames. In light of this fact, Admiral Halsey again recommends that all pending operations be canceled in favor of an immediate invasion of Leyte in the Philippines.
It was realized by the senior commanders that planned operations in Mindanao, which is the southernmost Philippine island, didn't need to be made ahead of a leap into the central Philippines. But it was in the works, and in a lot of ways that in hindsight look wrong. The decision was made by Admiral Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, that it was going to go forward, and it did.
Operation Stalemate, the invasion of Peleliu and Angaur, will go ahead as scheduled. In early September 1944, the assault force sails for the Palaus from bases in the southern Solomons. Aboard the transports, the men of the 1st Marine Division are optimistic about the operation. Major General Rupertus, the division commander, tells them this is going to be a short one, rough but fast. His prediction is tragically wrong.
We got a briefing, I think it was from a general. It said 72 hours from now we will have another base from which to probe further into the enemy heartland. 72 hours. Well, 72 hours later, we had guys that were still on the beach.
On D-3, the Fire Support Group began preliminary bombardment of the island. Turrets are loaded with 200-pound projectiles and 200 pounds of powder. 300 heavy guns train on the target. During 3 days and nights, the Navy will pour tons of hot steel on the island. The 40 millimeters alone will fire 100,000 shells. The big guns, more than 70,000. By the time the troop transports arrive offshore on D-1, Admiral Oldendorf, commander of the bombardment group, reports that his ships are out of targets.
We had all the big ships out there. There was more ships than I ever saw before in my life, and then the planes going in, shooting rockets in there and everything, and all hell was breaking loose everywhere.
You can see the ridges that were being bombarded by the aircraft over there, and smoke. I mean, you know, just hell.
They had battle wagons out there that were throwing slugs into fellows and blowing the hell out of everything you got there. In fact, I'm not sure it was very effective in taking care of the Japs, but what it did was very effectively knock out any cover you might have had when you got ashore.
Deep within his caves and tunnels, the enemy force is largely unharmed. Early on September 15th, under air cover provided by Halsey's Fleet Air Arm, the troops of the 1st Marine Division prepare for the assault. 3 regiments will land abreast on the western face of the island, fronting the airfield. The 1st and 7th would secure the flanks, while the 5th would land in the center and push inland to secure the airfield.
When we got to the coral reefs, we had to transfer to Amtrak. Here we lost a lot of men because we had so much weight on us. By the time we jumped, we had to wait till the Higgins boats and the Amtraks were level with each other in the surf and then jump. And some of them didn't make it. And those that fell in that were able to keep afloat at all were ground up between the 2 vessels.
As the assault boats cross the reef, Japanese smoke shells begin to fall, obscuring the landing area from the incoming wave and those who will support the Marines from offshore. The first wave, consisting of LVTAs, hits the beach at 0832 and commences immediate fire support for the following waves of infantry and LVTs. The Japanese, who had held fire until the first wave was ashore, opened up on the beach in the incoming waves near the reef.
The Japs had these big mortars. First time we ever ran into that big a mortar. Well, as we were going in there real close, these mortars were falling around there, and I seen one land right in the middle of an Amtrak, not too far from me and the bodies and everything, you know.
From assault boats disabled or hung up offshore, many Marines are forced to wade in.
They'd hang up on the coral, and when they hung up on the coral, that's when you come under the heavy fire because they weren't moving. We had to throw a couple of guys off. They kind of got paralyzed, and when you hit the water, take off for the beach. You never knew when that next step was how deep it was going to be or whether there was going to be anything there at all. It could be a hole you could go plumb out of sight. So once you hit the sand, it was damn near straight up. Well, we didn't go very far because we got the word pretty fast. You don't stick your head up over that sand dune. We had a lieutenant at that time. He was brand new. He ran up the beach. I never will forget this. He threw his hands up, forward man, and they blew all 3 fingers off of that hand and rolled him down the beach. And he was kind of in shock, but he said the war's over for me. And that was the last time we ever saw him.
The first men ashore fell under a concentration of small arms and mortar fire.
They dropped a couple behind us. They dropped them on each side of us. And I told Henry, I said, they got us bracketed, buddy. Better get the hell out of here. I dropped a grenade into the radio, and I said, go forward. There was a big log up there. I said, get on the other side of that log. Henry said, the Jap side? I said, hell yes, that's the only safe spot. They're going to power this place where we're at. And I got on the other side of that log, but my legs were hanging out. And I caught a chunk of shrapnel. I very carefully took that little packet off my belt, undid it, sprinkled some sulfa in that hole, put a bandage around it, and laid there for a minute. And I thought, well, now, you're going to get up and run and get shot at? What are you going to do? Make a decision. Well, once you got things in motion, it's like a rabbit.
Casualties are heavy as wave after wave is pinned down just yards from the shore.
I never seen so many dead and wounded Marines in all my life. Come ashore, and the first assault waves were right there on the beach, either dead or wounded, and it was bad.
Japanese infantry is everywhere, and for the first time, they are attacking, moving forward.
I saw a body lying up by a knocked-out Amtrak, and my first thought, well, it's a Marine. And so I crawled up to him, and it wasn't a Marine. It was a Japanese soldier, and he was dead. When I did come up on a wounded Marine after that, what we'd been trained to do, we sprinkled sulfa drugs on the wounds that we couldn't even clean. We had to put them on the way they were, slap on a battle dressing, apply morphine to prevent shock, tag the patient, and then call for stretcher bearers, and they would take them down to the beach, and they would be taken out to hospital ships.
In nearly 4 hours of bitter fighting, the Marines advance only 50 yards. Operation Stalemate is living up to its name. The strongest point of resistance is along a low coral ridge that rises 30 feet above the beach.
And you could never see where they were firing from. They had to hold the slits in there where they could fire out, but you couldn't see where they were coming from. That was a hell of a mess.
Assault from the beach is impossible, so the Marines fight inland, probing for a weakness in its defenses. Resistance is fierce and stubborn, but the attackers, fueled by pride and the knowledge that others depend on them, wear down the enemy position with flamethrowers, grenades, and guts. In 2 hours of vicious fighting at an ever-mounting cost to the attackers, the Marines overrun and destroy the Japanese position. Meanwhile, near the center of the beachhead, the terrain is more favorable for maneuver, and the attack is gaining ground.
We got ashore all right, and I set the battery up. See what happens there when you're an artillery officer. Your job is to go up in the front lines and scout. Really, you're out there. You're firing the weapons. You set the weapons up first, then you run up there at the front lines, and then you shoot, and you set everything up over, under, and you start shooting.
However, as the Marines reach the airfield, they're forced to dig in because of heavy artillery fire from the high ground to the north, a piece of real estate the Marines are already calling Bloody Nose Ridge. Pillboxes connected by a network of tunnels are taking a serious toll. No sooner is one cleared than another springs to life.
One time I was standing in one spot with several of my buddies around me, and they were all mowed down. A Jap came up through the foxhole and shot them. How I remained standing, I don't know. But it was pretty shocking to an 18-year-old boy.
The forward commanders call for assistance, and tanks move up to lend their supporting fire. Eventually, the area is cleared, and the Marines move forward. Other units move north across the exposed runways against intensifying Japanese artillery fire. At about 1640 hours, the Japanese make a tank infantry sortie across the northern portions of the airfield. This is no fanatical mass assault, but a coordinated, well-planned counterattack. Many of the following infantry were cut down by small arms fire, but the tanks broke through and were finally halted near the beach by bazookas and Sherman tanks.
We had a tank attack. Those little small Japanese tanks. They were like tin cans. They weren't very effective, and they knocked the Sherman sit back and knocked the hell out of them.
The crisis was met, and the beachhead that earlier was so precarious was made good. By nightfall, the division had established a line 3,000 yards long and 300 yards deep.
And during the night, there was an alert. Of course, the flares were going up, and there was an alert that there was a sniper in the area. And, of course, there were small arms firing all the way around. And about that time, I felt sharp prongs or something hitting my face. And it happened to be the sniper. And he had on hobnail boots that they used for climbing coconut trees. And he took off, and somebody got him down the way. He was there the next morning.
Dawn brings increased artillery fire from the enemy and a renewed Marine advance. Under deadly fire, the Marines reach the main service apron and hangar area on the airfield. It's there that they encounter Japanese resistance in strength. It takes all day to overcome the enemy position.
They'd come right out of those holes and shoot at you or laugh at you or any damn thing. And they didn't care. They didn't care whether they lived or not.
By the night of September 16, 1944, the airfield is in U.S. possession, but it cannot be used yet. Enemy fire sweeps anything that moves on it from carefully prepared positions on Bloody Nose Ridge.
They were dug into those Umbragal Mountains, which were solid coral covered with brush and shrubs and small trees and things. And the Japanese would be firing from all over, but you couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from.
Marine efforts to dislodge them encounter stiff resistance, and the casualties mount.
I couldn't understand the Marine Corps sending people down into doing something like that when it was ridiculous. That anybody with common sense, after you try it once or twice, that's it. But, you know, we're Marines, we can do anything. Yeah, sure.
Any movement forward brings fire from myriad cave entrances and fanatical resistance from the Japanese defenders. Tank and infantry teams make little progress against the strong positions, while fierce counterattacks make it difficult to hold on to the ground gained at such a terrible cost. General Rupertus had been only half right. The invasion of Peleliu is rough, but not quick. Peleliu becomes a battle of attrition, wearing down the bloodied Marines. Between the intense heat, water shortage, sleepless nights, and constant fire, all the men were suffering from exhaustion.
They delivered water in oil barrels that hadn't been cleaned out, so it was unpotable. You couldn't drink it. And secondly, it was about 115 degrees in heat there constantly, and that just was overwhelming.
On the fourth day of the invasion, 2 American planes land on Peleliu Airfield. From that point on, the airfield is in continuous operation. Marine pilots begin a virtual shuttle run against Japanese positions on Bloody Nose Ridge, one of the shortest bomber missions on record.
They'd circle up to get all kinds of altitude to go over and bomb about 500 feet from where they took off and drop these 1,000 bombers on these caves and try to get them, but they didn't do it. They were in there too deep.
After the capture of lightly defended Angaur Island, units of the 81st Army Division began reinforcing the Marines on the 23rd of September. The combined efforts of the 2 units finally drive the defenders back into a remote area honeycombed with caves. Infantry and demolition teams take on the slow, brutal task of prying the Japanese from their mountain strongholds. As they methodically grind away at the stubbornly resisting Japanese, the enemy makes an attempt to reinforce Peleliu from an adjacent island. As they approach Peleliu on September 23rd, the small convoy of slow-moving barges is met by artillery and direct fire from U.S. forces. Amphibious support Amtraks work over the few barges still afloat the following morning. Amazingly, a few survivors remain, but they meet their fate at the hands of Marine gunners when they attempt to escape. The barges are searched and 1 crewman is captured and taken back for questioning by Marine intelligence officers. A short distance across the strait from Peleliu lies an enemy-held island from which the Japanese are firing artillery. Its link to Peleliu is a fire-swept wooden bridge. LVTAs and infantry carrier LVTs are assigned the mission of assaulting this bastion. To protect the attack, Marine planes begin strafing the enemy positions and will not stop until the attack wave is 90 feet from the beach. The attack was set for September 28th. Armored support vehicles lead the landing force, followed by the LVTs filled with assault troops. With little loss, the attack crosses the narrow channel. LVTAs spearhead the landing and furnish covering fire for the Marines. Pillboxes and caves impeding the Marines' progress are disposed of, and the attack gains the small airstrip. But the Marines continue to be harassed by sniper fire.
The Japs were up in coconut trees, strapped in there, and we never knew that at first. Till we finally, guys were getting picked off, we wondered how in the hell that was happening.
Back on Peleliu, Japanese activity is diminishing, but is far from eliminated. Enemy positions are inundated from the air with napalm and 500-pound bombs, and artillery pounds any suspected targets.
Shoot whatever I was looking at. A lot of times it was Japs. Sometimes it was civilians, sometimes it was Army. You never knew who you was shooting at. You just something was moving, you was shooting.
The largest enemy concentration remained on Bloody Nose Ridge, and clearing it was a slow and costly process. Eventually, the Army surrounds the Japanese in the area, and while a few enemy troops surrender, most continue to resist and are left to starve in their caves.
You could hear them talking in the caves, you could hear them. We weren't that far from them, but they were back in there through about 4 foot of coral. You couldn't get at them, but you could hear them. They had water and everything. They had lights and everything else. They'd been preparing this for a long time.
20 years after the war ended, and some of these Japanese were still coming out of some of those bunkers and giving themselves up. Some of them even thought the war was still on.
With the airfields all in American hands, the action in the Palau Group sputters out. On October 12th, 27 days after the invasion, the island was declared secure, although fighting was still going on. The right flank of the drive on the Philippines has been secured at a tremendous cost in American lives. Nearly 4 out of every 10 assaulting Marines had become a casualty, and many of the survivors were bitter about an assault that seemed unnecessary.
You never hear about Peleliu. You hear about Iwo Jima, and you hear about places like that, but you don't hear about Peleliu, because that was a mistake. I never should have done it in the first place.
Well, the casualties were fantastic, and in my estimation, for no reason at all. Who needed that little chunk of rock out there? We could have bypassed it, starved them out, whatever.
Peleliu becomes a battle few wish to recall. With the establishment of B-29 bomber bases on Saipan and Tinian, it became imperative to U.S. planners to seize an island from which fighters could support the aerial assaults on the Japanese home islands. Such an airfield would also serve as a diversion point for crippled bombers, potentially saving thousands of lives. Their attention focused on Iwo Jima, some 600 miles from Japan and a step closer to Okinawa. Even as mopping up was still going on in the Marianas, superforts began making regular home deliveries to the Emperor's doorstep. While making the rounds, the B-29s would often see below the cone of a volcano that had risen from the sea. A forbidden island of brimstone and ashes less than 5 miles long. Beginning in November, B-24s and B-29s, later joined by carrier planes, began a series of airstrikes on Iwo that lasted 74 straight days.
We were carrying 1,000-pound blockbusters, they called them. Just dropped the thing straight on the target. And I think the most thing I remember about that was you look down there, and they had the prettiest little gardens in the small, only 8 or 10 feet maybe between the big rocks, but it was soil of some kind because they had the prettiest little gardens growing in there you'd ever expect to see.
No island was ever subjected to such a concentrated series of attacks as a prelude to invasion.
Iwo Jima was not very well defended when the bombardment started, but the Japanese got the message. So when it came time to take Iwo Jima in mid-February 45, it was built up with good weapons and sophisticated bunkers and caves and hideouts and so forth. The Japanese totally dominated the beaches.
Few outsiders had ever said,
I got a piece of cake. He said, within about 5 to 7 days, he said, we should be home. Yes, sir. We took his word for it. He lied.
On D-3, the Navy begins its pre-invasion bombardment. 6 battleships and their supporting forces inundated the island for 72 unbroken hours, sending tons of high-explosive rounds against the island, reducing it to a barren wasteland.
When we got up to Iwo and were lying offshore there, we could see them bombing the place by air. And I think the Missouri was there as one of the battleships. It was a very exciting thing to see all these ships shooting at the island and the bombs dropping, and something to remember.
On February 19th, while the pre-landing bombardment continues, Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions take their place in the landing boats with no illusions of what.
I think the public has the idea that Marine was Superman, but I don't think there was a Marine in the amphibious landing craft that wasn't afraid, including the officers.
The assault waves form up as H-hour approaches.
It's not a pleasant, you're hyped up to a point where you know you've got to do this and there's no way out, so you just hope and pray that things go good for you.
It was expected that 15,000 of these men would become casualties. As it turned out, that figure was conservative. At the signal from the central control vessel, the run to the beach begins.
We were airborne during what we call the combat air patrol, when the landing craft, if you will, came aboard to make their landing. So if there was a purpose, it was to make sure that the people right down near the shoreline didn't get up and fire at the landing craft or took a risk if they did.
I can remember my attitude very clearly. I said, hell, they can't hurt me. And after a bit, I could look around and say, I hope they don't hurt me. And a short while later, I was saying, I hope I don't get killed.
Volcanic ash and black sand slows their charge to a walk, then a laborious crawl. The difficulties of moving soon create a mammoth pileup of men and material on the beachhead. And then, according to plan, enemy positions open up from all over Iwo Jima.
Just lying there.
Shells crashed among the Marines, and machine gun and mortar fire took an awesome toll.
Suribachi, of course, provided enfilade fire from one side, which was murderous on I think the 5th Division was there. The 4th Division went in on the other side, and it was enfilade fire. There was a tremendous cliff area, which overlooked this so-called harbor. There wasn't much of a harbor. And so not only was there the sand terraces, but you had enfilade fire from both sides.
But tactically, the Japanese have made a mistake. The time taken to set up the ambush allowed the Americans to get bulldozers, tanks, and artillery ashore, and they go to work.
The bulldozer had made a road up through the initial terraces of black sand. And I could see the wounded and the bodies strewn around the beaches and the blown up tanks and trucks and Amtraks and such as that. So
Extreme left, the 27th Marines, facing a wall of fire from concealed enemy positions, failed to reach even the foot of Mount Suribachi. On the right, the 4th Marine Division is pinned down by fire from a fortified ridge atop a rock quarry. By 1630, the position is taken, but the effort had cost the 25th Marines' 3rd Battalion 550 of its 700 men. Late in the afternoon, the Marine Reserves come in through the terrible fire, grimly taking their losses.
It was probably about as rough as any of them that were out there, including Tarawa, which was a bad one. It's kind of hard to think about some of that stuff because on the 3rd wave when we did land, there was a lot of them that didn't make it. They were still floating around right out on the beach.
Some of them stay to fight. Some of them just stay. Others go right back out to hospital ships.
When they would bring these P-boats with the wounded Marines in them up on the Welland Davids, there's a hoist system, they bring them up. The sound of that boat being hooked up to the Welland Davids after a while got to be kind of hard to listen to because you knew what was coming. You could hoist them on board, bring them up to the deck, and unload the wounded in the stretchers right into the room where I had 2 operating room tables set up. And I worked with 2 surgeons. And that was essentially what we were doing, taking care of a lot of good American Marines.
As night falls, destroyers move in close to shell the slopes of Suribachi.
You'd see the destroyers come in real close to Mount Suribachi, and they were shelling with their 40-millimeter turrets and 5-inch guns. And they would use searchlights to pick up the caves, and they were shelling the seaward side of Mount Suribachi.
Artillery ashore pounded the Japanese all night, but with little effect. Return fire took a deadly toll, and near dawn, a Japanese shell struck an ammunition dump. Mount Suribachi dominates the first few days. Its heights control the landing area and reducing Suribachi fell to the men afoot, who, with carbines, bayonets, grenades, satchel charges, and flamethrowers, grimly set about scaling its flanks. Early on the morning of D+4, Marine patrols finally reached the top. The men lash a small American flag to a section of pipe and plant it atop the summit.
Somebody alerted us to the fact that we should turn around and look at Suribachi, and there was that flag fired. And it was a great sight. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. About 10 o'clock in the morning, that first flag went up.
Later, a larger flag was raised, and it's this event, captured by photographer Joe Rosenthal, that became the most famous image of the war in the Pacific. Caught by the strong winds that whipped Suribachi's crest, the stars and stripes inspired the men below.
We were far enough away that we had to look at it with glasses, but I swore to God you could count the stars. You know, that was the most unbelievable feeling because we knew what those guys had gone through. And I want to get it in the record. It was 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman that put the thing up, too.
But of the 6 men who participated in this historic moment, 3 would never know its importance. Within a few days, they were killed in action on Iwo Jima. And though the flag proclaimed that Suribachi was ours, the fierce fight for the bulk of Iwo Jima remained. While the 5th Division had been assaulting Suribachi, the 4th had been able to gain very little.
On D+1, when we shoved off, it was all planned. We had done this. We had taken Iwo Jima so many times in training. It was almost by rote we could do it. An aerial bombardment was supposed to be at 0700, and the artillery then would commence at 0715, and the tanks would jump off at 0730, and the infantry at 0732. None of this happened. The aerial was late. The artillery was even later. We jumped off, and we never did see the infantry. And we were the lead platoon. All through practice for the fire base, and now we're the lead platoon.
Though coordination was to improve, the division was thwarted by numerous enemy positions on its right, and on its left, the open airfield, elaborately seeded with a profusion of mines and swept by anti-tank guns.
We ran into 47-millimeter German anti-aircraft guns, and those would drill holes right through the sponson of our tank with sponsons aside, just like you would take a steel bit And we had a lot of men injured and a lot of them killed.
Out on the ocean, Japanese kamikazes struck the supporting carrier force on the 21st, sinking the escort carrier Bismarck C and damaging Lunga Point. The veteran Saratoga was hit 4 times, and her crew suffered more than 300 casualties. The fleet off Iwo was likewise attacked by kamikazes, and an LST carrying 3rd Division tankers was hit.
And I looked up and I saw this plane coming in. And I thought, well, that's got to be one of ours. You know, I didn't have any idea it'd be a kamikaze until he got down close enough, and then he winged over and dove into the side of the ship. Now, if he'd have kept coming the way he was going, he would have hit the stern and knocked out the propellers and crippled the ship completely. But he didn't, and he didn't fire a shot at us. You know, just blew himself up, and he killed quite a few Marines, too, and a lot of sailors, because it hit right in the crew's quarters.
Conditions on the beaches, however, had steadily improved, and in spite of intermittent shelling and high surf, LSTs were able to discharge their cargo directly onto the beaches.
We set up our main supply dump just below the airfield embankment, and it was a good place for that because it's a small island. The troops didn't vary their positions very much. It was very slow going to the end of the island. And certainly we didn't experience much but harassing fire in the service troops areas. They had these big 300 millimeter mortars that would shake the ground, and some artillery fire. But by then they were at the point that they weren't disclosing their positions because the Marines go right after them.
On February 24th, the battle to take Iwo Jima's airfields began.
The rumor was that all the tanks are going to go up there that day, hub to hub, and we're going to take that airfield. Or we're going to go back to the beach, dig the tanks in, and wait for the rest of the Corps to come up from Saipan, but we're not getting off the island. That was the rumor.
The Shermans cover the approach of the infantry, or follow as the situation dictates.
The mortars didn't bother us nearly as much as they bothered the unprotected infantry. They needed us to knock out the pillboxes and the other fortifications, but when we were near them, we drew an awful lot of mortar fire. So tanks were a mixed blessing. The Japanese would hit us with mortars, and we'd try to find the mortar positions and fire back at them. And you sit there on a road, you had no way to go sideways, and you try to outguess them as, oh, all right, move forward 50. That one came right down our tail, move forward 50. And the next one would be 10 yards in front of you. All right, move back 10. And just try to outguess whoever the mortarman was until they knocked him out. The infantry had knocked him out. But we were nothing more than mobile pillboxes.
Progress was agonizingly slow. One Japanese position would fall only to unmask another, often stronger one. The entire island is a maze of tunnels and trenches.
They could go from point A to point B to C to D and never come off the ground. I mean, never come above ground.
You very seldom saw live Japanese. I can remember one day in a fire trench between two probably pillboxes, and the Japanese soldiers were in that fire trench, and the bulldozer was filling it in from one end. And as they came out the other end, either that, stay in and be buried, or get out and try to run. They were cut down.
And so it went. All 3 divisions of 5th Amphibious Corps crept forward a few hundred yards every day. The 5th Division on the left, the 3rd in the center, the 4th on the right, supported always by the guns and planes of the 5th Fleet.
The people on the island had contact with our pilots, and they would tell them the vector that they want them to bomb, and that we were doing the same thing basically there, only we were carrying 4 500s, and one 500 was doing the job for like silence and no gun emplacements and stuff.
Yet despite our firepower, the Marines still own barely half the island. During the terrible fighting that remained, the mileage rate for Iwo would remain fixed. 4,000 casualties per mile. Only a stubborn, grinding advance, a battle fought in inches and feet, and the Japanese meet it in those terms. It's a hot, dirty, close-range fight in a surreal landscape. The Japanese positions are superbly camouflaged and constructed.
I think the popular phrase is, we were on the island, they were in the island. And I've always been of the opinion that if it hadn't been for the flamethrower, we'd still be fighting the Japanese in the islands. It was the only thing to get those people out with.
There are no tactics in such a battle other than that of the squad and the three-man fire team. Nothing to chronicle but the continual daily combat made up of a series of smaller battles.
We just kept on fighting northbound, and that was pretty tough going up there, and that's when our flamethrowers became pretty important because they could shoot this flame, I would say 300 or 400 feet, and they'd shoot a big stream of that stuff up into these caves and burn the Japs out. It was very effective. But anyway, I was sitting there watching these flamethrowers go, and a Jap was laying in the brush right beside the road, and he jumped up and threw a satchel charge underneath my tank. And it knocked out one of our engines. We had twin Jimmy diesels, and it knocked out one of the engines. But I could still operate. In the meantime, my driver and assistant driver, they'd bailed out. When the infantry got rid of this guy that threw the satchel charge, they came back, and I really gave them hell. I said, you damn fool, you left with the hatches open, and myself and the gunner and the radio man are still in the tank, and you guys bailed out and left us. And so they didn't particularly like what I told them, but I was really mad.
By February 28th, the Marines had captured the second airstrip. But much of the island's roughest terrain and toughest defenses were yet to be faced. As days of inhuman suffering and uncommon valor merged into nights of sacrifice and terror, the names of such places as the Meat Grinder, the Amphitheater, and Turkey Knob were burned forever into the souls of the men who survived.
Up on Hill 362, the Meat Grinder, we lost over 200 Marines to try to take that in about 3 hours. The carnage, the death was you should have to be there to see it.
And one of the Marines had been a gunnery sergeant, grizzled old guy. I remember him watching me, and he couldn't talk, but he knew what was happening to him, but he was a Marine. He didn't whine about it. He didn't cry out for Mama. He didn't cry out to God. Didn't cry out to anybody. He knew what was ahead of him, and so when he passed, there was only one of us breathing, so he was a real man.
On March 4th, the Marines see what they have fought and died for. A crippled B-29 makes an emergency landing.
One of the B-29s that was going back to Tinian lost a motor or two, and he landed right there on Iwo Jima before the island was secured. And that was the first B-29 I ever saw. That was the biggest thing that I I couldn't figure out something like that big could fly.
Before the end of the war, more than 2,000 B-29 crews were spared the hazard of ditching at sea and successfully landed on Iwo Jima. P-51 fighters will fly from the captured airfields to escort the bombers over Japan. American possession of Iwo Jima will save more lives than it cost to take it. By March 9th, the bulk of the Japanese defenders have been driven into the northeast corner of the island. In one area alone, 500 by 1,000 yards, the Japanese have more than 300. It becomes too costly, and flamethrowers burn out what can't be blasted out.
There was a myriad of caves, and they were holding our infantry back. Our tank had a flamethrower that we could pull the lap gun out, which is a 30 caliber machine gun, and put this flamethrower in the same place and shoot it. But anyway, we used that, and we just mowed the area down there in front of us and cleaned them right out of there.
After nearly 5 weeks of fighting, of the 21,000 Japanese on Iwo, 20,000 had followed their code and chosen death by American hands or their own. Many of those who remained were giving themselves up, choosing life over certain death. At last, face to face with their enemy, the Marines' humanity responded to that of their prisoners. And in typical fashion, in spite of the blood, carnage, and even personal injury, the men never lost their sense of humor.
I didn't want to get evacuated, and to this day, I don't know whether I refused evacuation because I didn't want to leave my friends, or I was afraid of being put in an infantry replacement outfit. At any rate, they sent me to the field hospital, and a few hours later, some corpsman sewed my cheek up. He put 3 stitches in it, in this wound. And I asked him, no anesthesia, no nothing. And I asked him, I said, what the hell did you do before the war, sew sacks? And he said, yes. And he was from my hometown in California. I didn't know him. Now, my real story about this wound, this scar, is that, and I know this is an embellishment, there were 8 of them that came at me, and I only had 7 shots in my .45. The 8th guy slapped me right across the face with his sword. I have the sword.
Except for scattered pockets of resistance and sporadic raids from the few remaining Japanese, the Marines' battle for Iwo Jima is almost over.
One night, a whole mess of Japs got together. They crawled out of their caves, and got together, and they came down there and attacked these flyers who had tents set up. And they killed quite a few of the flyers. They just went in there and stabbed them and bayoneted them and anything. And they also lost all the Japs, which was quite a few.
With this final attack snuffed out, organized resistance on Iwo Jima ends. On March 26th, General Holland Smith declares the island officially secure. The fight for Iwo Jima had caused nearly 22,000 casualties and cost almost 6,000 American lives. The U.S. Marines had won the fiercest battle in their history. As Admiral Nimitz put it, on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue.
Finally, when we left the island, there were just 6 from my outfit, and we were on the fantail, as just glad to get the hell out of there. And I remember Green and a couple of the other guys were on the fantail. We were looking at the island, and Green looked at me and he says, Sarge, was it worth it? We lost a lot of our friends. I said, I don't know. And until it disappeared, the island, none of us said anything more.
After the fall of Iwo Jima in early 1945, only the capture of Okinawa stood between America's forces and the invasion of the enemy's home islands. Okinawa dominated the China Sea. Its possession would enable America to completely sever enemy forces in Southeast Asia and the Philippines from Japan.
Okinawa was extremely significant because it had major airfields in place. It had good harbors, anchorage. There were islands around that could be used for early warning radar, for example, and so forth. It was, in many ways, a European-style battle fought in the Pacific because Okinawa was so big. It's also the place where the Central Pacific Drive and the Southwest Pacific Drive to the Philippines actually met. And they met there for one reason and one reason only: air bases to support the invasion of Japan. It was the ultimate strategic battle of the Pacific War. I mean, as important as the Marianas were, this is a strategic battle for the base from which Japan was going to be taken down.
It's dawn, April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. With the roar of rockets, the final naval barrage begins. A searing rush of white-hot steel tortures the air. This is the integrated explosive agony that the Americans have learned to unleash on the enemy in their advance across the Pacific. The big naval guns let loose, hoping to take out enemy gun emplacements and positions.
The island was very quiet. You couldn't see anything, but there was a number of caves. It looked like big holes, and it's supposed that the Japs had cannons back in the caves that they could roll out and fire and then get them back in where they weren't visible. So we would locate these caves, and the battleship, which was sitting back here 5 miles, they could take target on any of these kind of things, and they could pinpoint right in close.
Even as the men climb into the landing craft and form up for the run into the beaches, the naval barrage continues. Most are veterans of the Pacific War and know from experience that such devastating firepower has never before silenced the implacable enemy. All the devices created by American industry and tactics developed in the island-hopping campaign now arrive at the door of the Japanese Empire. It's Sunday, Easter, 1945.
There were 3 or 4 Army divisions and 2 Marine divisions. The 6th Marine Division, that was their first action. And some of it was made up of former raiders from the Raider Regiment. And the 1st Marine Division, of course. When they landed, there was really no defensive action on the part of the Japanese. They let us come ashore. Happened to be on Easter, which was also April Fool's Day that year.
It is quiet. Too quiet. The first assault waves hit the beach at 0830. 10 minutes later, all assault waves are ashore. The Americans have not been fired upon, but still, they're cautious. They've been told about Iwo Jima, how the Japanese waited for the Marines to get ashore and then rained death and destruction down upon them. The assault troops expect violent resistance at any time. After all, it is April 1st, and the troops look at the ease of the landing with skepticism, as if it were a bad April Fool's joke.
The way the briefing officers were explaining to us that there probably was a situation pretty much like Omaha Beach as far as obstacles for along the beach before we could even get in there. So we'd just be a sitting target, But none of that happened. So it was kind of like April Fool's Day.
The Americans probed cautiously inland, then faster, then really pick up momentum.
We made more in the first day on Okinawa than we had expected to make in 3 days. And the reason was, and I didn't find this out till after the war, is we were going in, the 2nd Marine Division that was not making the landing made a false landing down in the south, the very southern tip of Arasaki, of Okinawa. And as they came in and they released some old oil-soaked lumber and parts of boats and so on and lit it on fire, so it looked like there had probably been hit. The Japanese were shooting at them, and that there was a fire, and that they turned around as though they'd been chased back.
While the diversion was a success, it was probably unnecessary. Contrary to what U.S. intelligence had reported, the Japanese never really planned to heavily defend the landing beaches.
We just walked ashore and wondered what the hell happened. There was nobody there. They'd all moved down south because they were that was the diversion. So anyway, got on there and we started. First we were shocked because nobody was there, not a soul. It's just like walking across the street.
Advancing across farmers' fields, the troops moved steadily forward toward the Yongtan and Kadena airfields. The only resistance was light and sporadic, easily cleaned up by Marine fire teams and riflemen. Amtraks support the infantry in the drive forward. The Yongtan and Kadena airfields, where the American planners expected to have to fight for days, are in U.S. hands by noon. The base defenses are undamaged and unmanned. Seabees get to work on the airfields, and on D+2, a Marine observation plane lands on the airfield, the first American plane to land on Japanese home soil since the beginning of World War II. Along all the fronts on Okinawa, it's the same. The troops encounter only light and sporadic resistance. The 1st Marine Division overruns their first 20 days of planned objectives in just 4 days. The 6th Marine Division reaches their Day 15 objectives in the same 4-day period. The Japanese have withdrawn their strength to as yet undisclosed positions. It was part of the enemy's defensive strategy, forcing the Americans to find them and then fight them on their own ground, under their conditions and terms. It was to be a war of attrition, long, vicious, and deadly. The 6th Marine Division seals off the narrow neck of the Ishikawa Isthmus and pushes north. On D+9, they encounter their first strong enemy resistance.
We had no problem until we hit Motobu Peninsula. And at that point, my company still went straight to the very tip of Okinawa. And then the tanks couldn't work in there anyhow because it was just a bunch of little peaks and so on. But there were quite a few Japs on Motobu Peninsula, and it took a regiment and then finally another reinforced regiment to clean that out.
The Japanese had chosen their defense position well. The hills are 1,500 feet high and infested with natural and man-made caves. Perpendicular cliffs with natural cover defy penetration. But this is not a coral island like Tarawa or Kwajalein, which must be overrun quickly. Here the Marines have time. They bring up concentrations of artillery and additional troops. As Commanding General Simon Buckner said, we will take our time and kill the Japanese gradually. Marine close air support burns away the concealment. Naval gunfire is damaging to the positions, but does little to reduce their effectiveness or kill enemy personnel. The Japanese simply run deeper into their caves and then pop up when the bombardment is over. But the Marines, in vicious hand-to-hand fighting, finally take the advantage. A few small bands of Japanese escape into the hills, using ineffective hit-and-run tactics to harass the American forces, but never seriously threaten cleanup operations in the north. Late one night, while guarding their field hospital, Medical Corpsman Ed Powell and his partner had an unnerving close encounter.
Just kind of sitting there looking around, and my partner gave me the jab in the ribs, and I looked up, and we saw this form coming up, approaching the foxhole. You just see the outline of a figure. And so we both opened fire, and we must have emptied a couple of clips apiece. And then the rest of the night we kept thinking, that's one of our guys coming up there, you know. We didn't, there was no password given or anything like that. What if it's one of our guys? But it wasn't. Next morning when it was daylight, of course, we sat there and sweated that out all night long. It was a Japanese medical officer. He had a Luger pistol type 25 caliber. A lot of the Japanese had those. It had 2 rounds left in it. One of them was in the chamber. And we went through his belongings for identification, and he was a medical officer. And quite probably he was coming in to get medical supplies or food or I don't know what. But that was also a harrowing experience. And you never feel good about those things.
After days of intense combat, the northern Japanese forces are all but defeated. Units of the 6th Marine Division are eventually able to seal and secure the Motobo Peninsula, the offshore island, and the remainder of the northern area. The 1st Marine Division seals and secures its area, including the Kachin Peninsula and offshore island. However, in the south, the situation is not so favorable. On D-Day, the Army's 24th Corps landed on the right, executed a wheeling movement, and for the next 4 days drove swiftly inland. From D+4 to D+10, enemy resistance stiffened. From D+11, the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions of the U.S. Army find themselves face to face with the real Japanese strength on Okinawa. Whereas the Marine drive to the north had been opposed by only 3,000 enemy troops, the 24th Corps is fighting almost 100,000 well-entrenched Japanese. The Japanese defense plan for Okinawa is simple. Allow the Americans to get ashore where you engage them in a war of attrition, while the kamikaze attacks destroy the American fleet.
When the 5-inch guns went off, we knew that we were being attacked. They were shooting pretty well out. And then when the 40 millimeters started to go, you know that somebody's making a run on you. And then when the 20s went off and they're all going at the same time, then you know you're going to get it. You know, that's when you start looking for a rivet to hide under or something, anything. You know, it's hard to hide on a ship.
Ultimately, the kamikaze cannot stop the American juggernaut. The fanatical pilots right. Beginning on April 30th, Marine units are withdrawn from the north and assigned objectives in the south.
The Army, they run into a lot of trouble down there in the south and said, so you guys go, you can go in and sign with them. So we did. We wanted the Army down there, and that's when we ran into hell.
By May 10th, the realignment is complete and Army and Marine divisions are ready for a concerted assault. Marine pilots fly 600 close air support missions in 13 days. Rockets, bombs, and 150,000 gallons of napalm destroy the enemy's concealment.
And looking out, they had a lot of caves, big caves, and matter of fact, religious places, and then they'd hide in there. We got so the guys could hit the openings of those fairly well from the air, and saved a lot of problems of recapture and all that. And matter of fact, they just block them off. Whoever was in there was in there for good.
Rain puts a damper on progress on the ground, turning the roads into quagmires. But still, the trucks move forward. Some frontline units have to be resupplied by air when the roads finally become impassable. In 17 days, 15 inches of rain fell, flooding camps and putting the planned offensive on hold. When the rains finally subsided, the Americans began their assault. American soldiers and Marines advance into the hills that have been laboriously prepared by the Japanese for defense.
We came in on the western flank of the line, called the Naha Yanabaru Sugarloaf Defense Line. And to our left was the 1st Marine Division, and the 27th Infantry Division, then another division. They had decided that General Ishimane had made his defense line the Shuri Castle in a mountain called, low mountain called Sugarloaf Hill.
From May 14th to the 19th, the Battle of Sugarloaf Hill is waged, one of the most costly ever, and also one of the most crucial.
I made the first attack on Sugarloaf Hill with my 18 tanks. We had fought down to where we were just entering a little kind of a draw and leading up to Sugarloaf Hill, which sounds like a big deal. Well, it was a big deal fighting-wise, but it wasn't that much of a hill. It was kind of a little innocuous hill, maybe 200 feet tall at the most, but it was shaped like a sugar loaf, and we were in a kind of a little slow rise and ground moving up towards it. We were moving laterally along the front, not knowing it was the front, and suddenly we started to hit some mines. And the tank ahead of me hit a mine, and what we would do, we had towing cables already hooked the shackle, so when this happened, we would throw the cable over and hook it onto the tank behind, and you could pull it out. So George Baranek was the platoon sergeant, and he hit the mine, and he went out to get this cable, and he threw it up and got it on my tank. And as he did that, he was shot here in the neck, and the blood just gushed out all over my tank and all over him and everything else. Well, we finally figured out that the Jap, we never saw a Jap, and this fight went on for about an hour and a half. But they had, all of Sugarloaf Hill was honeycombed with caves. They had a galley down there, had a hospital down there, and had ammunition down there. And the way they would fight, they had tunnels going up and ladders in those tunnels, and then they had little chunks of sod on pieces of wood at the top, and at night they'd push those up and come out. And then they had in the side of the hill, they had little slots, little apertures, and if you were in line with that, you were a dead duck. But if you're a little bit to the one side of it, you could stand up there and nothing would happen. there were several infantry that had been hit, and then we got them down and put them on a tank. And I was outside trying to direct this. We got most of the tanks back, infantry back out, and we tried to figure out what the plan would be. And I said, well, I've got to get, because of all the shooting we'd done, I said, I've got to get these tanks back and get ammunition and gas, or we won't be able to go tomorrow. The Major said, Bull, you're going to stay up here with us tonight. I said, fine, Major. You know, I'm no gutless wonder. We'll stay up here with you tonight, but you're not going to have us tomorrow then. So we talked this over, and he finally said, okay, go ahead. Now this Major that night called the radio men and the messengers and all the spare parts and said, of the battalion that was there, said, okay, we had the big pocket utilities at that time. He said, load those pockets up with grenades. He said, I'm going to the top of that mountain. And he said, the more Marines we can get on top of that mountain today, we can save a bunch of lives tomorrow. So he went up there that night, and in the morning, he had about 40 to 50 men. That morning there were 8 left, and he was killed. He got a Congressional Medal of Honor.
Ownership of the hill changes hands 11 times. It was a horrific battle. It was the key position in the Japanese defensive line, and they had had plenty of time to prepare for the American assault. When the invasion forces landed, there was hardly any enemy resistance, and now the Americans understood why. The Japanese had put all their time and resources into building this line of defense. This was their fortress. They were going to fight to the death for Japan, for the Emperor, for honor. Battling an enemy that is unconcerned with death is a terrifying proposition and makes for an extremely tough battle to win, as the Marines on Sugarloaf found out. It was a battle that was unsurpassed in Marine Corps history for the strategic importance of its outcome, for its unrelenting bitterness, and for the lives it cost per foot of ground won. Over 2,500 Americans were killed or wounded in close contact fighting with the well-entrenched Japanese forces.
For 8 days, we fought for that damn hill. Meantime, losing tanks and so on. At one time, I was down to 4 tanks out of 18. And we finally, we got some 5 flamethrowers from the Army. This is an interesting thing. It's called the POA, Pacific Ocean Area, flame-throwing tank. It was an M4 tank with a big volume, a great big vat inside that would shoot out flame out of the tube of the gun, and it would shoot it for 4 minutes in a distance of almost 200 yards, maybe not quite 200 yards. And we got those guys, we got them in and sort of got around behind this hill, and they could shoot into the caves that they saw back there. And that's when it burned on down, we could hear and rumble. The ground would shake, their ammunition went off inside this hill. Then one of these days, we got there, and there were a whole bunch of Jap soldiers coming in, and it was just a slaughter. We just wiped them all up. They were coming in to replace, and that's when we found out from one of them that these guys were from the West Coast, so that the Army was over there, had nobody in front of them. And they didn't go for a while, and finally they were ordered to go ahead and go, and they went, and geez, they went all the way to in their zone, all the way to the coast, because all of the Japs had come over here to reinforce Sugarloaf Hill. Well then, after those slaughtering and some more battles for the thing, we finally got down behind them, and we're firing right back up into those caves, and we got down to a little stream just before Naha, and we said, okay, we had Sugarloaf Hill.
On the 18th of May, the Marines have secured Sugarloaf Hill. The battle is finally over. Below lies Naha, the ancient capital of Okinawa. The U.S. forces have broken through the first of the Japanese defense lines, but the enemy is far from giving up. Japanese resistance on the hills to the east remains bitter and vicious. They're fighting a series of delaying actions to cover the withdrawal of the Japanese 32nd Army. Targets are found in the outlying areas around Naha, and the Marines open fire. On the night of May 22nd, U.S. forces break through the ring of defenses, and on May 27th, they enter the city.
Naha, incidentally, was quite an interesting, because they had a brewery down there. And that Naha was leveled except for the brewery, and it was still sitting there when we went through. Nobody wanted to shoot that brewery.
The population of 65,000 has abandoned their battered, rubble-strewn city. Fire teams infiltrate into the maze of rubble, systematically destroying enemy pockets of resistance and clearing the city of snipers. The Marines move quickly through Naha's pulverized streets and back out into the countryside to pursue the retreating Japanese. Time is measured only in the names of positions captured. Queen Ridge, Horseshoe, Charlie, Sugarloaf. Fatigue mounts and casualties increase. Some Japanese, coming to the conclusion that their situation is hopeless, turn to horrific acts of self-sacrifice, taking their own lives in an effort to kill just a few more Americans.
They'd come in with their hands up in the air, and we thought they were surrendering. They had hand grenades in each hand, and we'd have a circle of guys, and they'd come in, next thing you know, kaboom, and they hold them like it, and all you see is his guts fly out. And they could get us too, just as well.
A woman came running out there with her hands up, and they shot her right away. And the Marines around us shot her, and come to find out that she had her hands, as long as they were up, they're okay, but when she pulled them down, she had grenades behind her head, so anybody got close to her would have got it, besides her, committing suicide herself. And we ran across, in the cane field areas, a lot of Japanese suicide squads that had committed carry out there, and towards the end of the campaign, it got really hairy after we moved to the south part of the island.
The stress inevitably leads to casualties of the spirit. Young men who have seen and done too much pause to recover from the shock of unceasing violence. Finally, Shuri Castle falls, and the assaulting Americans have irretrievably breached the Japanese defensive lines. The U.S. forces used their absolute control of the sea to conduct a series of outflanking amphibious attacks.
We made a second landing down on Oruku Peninsula, and it was west of the city of Naha. And we sent some tanks from my company into Naha, and we made this landing. And as we came up, the Japs did not expect us to make this landing, and their guns were all turned the wrong way. So we caught them by surprise there, and we made a significant gain, and we were right up into the Jap defensive positions. And I said, geez, we're right into it here, you know, and I said, we're going to catch it. But we didn't, because we had gone so far that the guys coming in later, 2 or 3 hours later, after they got their guns wrong, were being laid into by the Japanese back on the beach.
On the morning of June 21st, Army and Marine units launched the final assault against the 3 remaining pockets of resistance at the southern end of the island.
There was a bunch of brush just growing up like this, and we surrounded it, and the infantry was there, and I said, you want me to bring in the flamethrowers with the tanks? And they said, no, we'll take care of this, Phil. Well, the first guy that starts into that brush gets shot right in the forehead. So there were Japs in there. So they said, okay, Phil, bring in your flamethrowers. So I stationed the 5 flamethrowers around this thing, and they shot not into the grass, but over it. And by doing this, they drew all the oxygen out. And when we finally went in there were Japanese with not a mark on them, dead from suffocation, no oxygen. And then, of course, after this, they did burn the thing, but there were no more casualties from that.
By 1000 hours, the breakthrough is complete. And now time reverts to its familiar measurement. 82 days ago, American forces landed on the island. After 82 days of battle, Okinawa is won. As the weary Army and Marine battalions reverse and begin the sweep to wipe out bypassed pockets of resistance, they sense the cracking of Japanese fanaticism. For the first time in 3 years, many of the enemy respond to the appeals of U.S. psychological warfare teams who drop surrender leaflets near the remaining Japanese positions. By June 30th, more than 7,000 have surrendered. Some must be flushed from their hiding places. To fight on against insurmountable odds.
It was a cleanup. The war was over. The 81st day, I guess it was, and the war was over. And I looked over in a damn cave, and I said, it looks like there's a Jap in that cave there. And I said, we better get him out of that out of the cave. We threw a hand grenade in there and smoke grenade, trying to smoke them out. We didn't get very far, and he started shooting, and he shot me right straight through. I got shot here and out my back, and it took the forefinger off of my executive officer. And my colonel said to me, asked me if I was all right, and I says, you know, you never feel anything when you're shot or hurt, because it's just, you're dead, it's numb. I said, oh, I'm okay. I said, a little burning up here in the top. And he looked around the back, and he says, you know something? I said, what? He said, you've been shot clear through. It went in like a dime, come out like a dollar.
Ren Cutlip was lucky, for Okinawa was a killing field, a factory of death that left more than 100,000 Japanese dead. U.S. losses are nowhere near that figure, totaling about 49,000 dead or wounded, but severe by any standard. The civilian residents of Okinawa who suffered greatly from the wounds of war are left with nothing but a chance to live, a chance that seemed so very slim just a couple of weeks before.
Okinawa was a tragedy for the residents, the citizens who lived there, because thousands of them were killed.
American servicemen revert to kinder and gentler ways than those they had violently pursued for the previous 3 months. The battle for Okinawa was over, but to the combat-weary soldiers and innocent civilians, the experiences of war's brutality sweeping across their faces, the battle would be a long time in fading from their memory. Although they did not know it, the Marines had just fought the last land action of World War II. Their men, weapons, techniques, and equipment had all been tested by fire, proven by victory. Behind them stretched 3 years of conflict, over thousands of miles of the trackless Pacific to Pearl Harbor, where it all began, when a shocked and enraged America first called its Marines to war. How grim and costly had been the years of combat since then against a determined enemy. The survivors honor those who have fallen, comrades in arms who have given the full measure for freedom. Their passing has been fully vindicated, for in the progress of the relentless course of the Marines' war, oppression and aggression have been put to an end. From the wreckage of the war in the Pacific would rise the edifices of free nations. The Marines fought for freedom, for America, and for the Corps. Truly, for them, uncommon valor was a common virtue.